I didn't believe it. But you saw it. You saw it, didn't you?
Yes, I saw it.
As God is my witness, I saw the thing. It's unbelievable.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
In the beginning, there was light. Light by way of a generating station in Niagara Falls which pumped electricity to Buffalo, New York. This was in 1895. Buffalo was 20 miles away, and the facility at Niagara was the very first central generating system operating at this large a scale. And thanks to Tesla and his AC current, which proved more reliable than Edison's DC current, the gates were open for more facilities and distribution lines. Light had come to America, and the streets were a bit brighter than they had been in the past. Over the next few decades, artificial light would invade our homes. The light switch would become a household item. You could go from room to room, flicking switches at your heart's content, and there was one switch which controlled them all, the main switch. The main switch regulated the electricity coming in from the power station. It had two simple positions, on and off. On and you had electricity, off and it was time for bed. Main switches, those master controllers, are everything. Nestled comfortably within our DNA are another set of switches. Like the light switches that you casually flip on and off in your home, these are responsible for making you who you are. And these are our genes. Turn some on, and you have blue eyes and blonde hair. Flip some off, and you might be a little bit shorter than you would have been had they not been flipped off at all. Genes, as you are well aware, control how we look and even how we act. How much they affect our behavior is a matter of debate, but the fact remains that our genes, our light switches, are the keys to the kingdom when it comes to understanding the many shapes and sizes of all living things. And just like that one regulating switch which controls the current of electricity to your home, you have one which controls certain sets of genes. It's called the PAX gene. Although the term master control gene may not be entirely accurate, it's the best way to describe what it does. It dictates which switches are set to on and which ones are set to off. It's a transcription service for animal development. Every animal. PAX genes are a group of genes responsible for gene expression. And instead of having to figure out which bank of switches are on and off every time an embryo is formed, the PAX genes take care of all of that. They carry instructions for making the proteins which attach to areas of DNA. PAX stands for paired box, by the way. There are 4 groups of PAX genes, at least as far as mammals are concerned. Each group contains 2 genes, with the exception of group 2, which contains 3. Now, don't worry, you're not going to be tested on this. Just know that each PAX gene is responsible for the expression of a group of genes. The one we are going to look at today is a PAX gene located in group 4. This little gene is known as PAX6. It's probably the one we know the most about, and the story behind what we know about it and what this gene has taught us is nothing short of amazing. If you've ever seen a circuit breaker, you know it's a bank of switches that control the electricity to different rooms in your home. One switch might control the lights in your bedroom and your bathroom. The one below it might control the kitchen and the living room. Overload an area, and the switch in control of that area will cut the electricity. It's a regulator. Now, instead of rooms in your home, let's replace those with body parts and organs. Instead of the bedroom, bathroom, and hallways, the PAX6 gene is responsible for the eyes, brain, and spinal cord. When you adjust an embryo, this little guy dictated the formation of your eyes and the area of your brain which processes smell, and your central nervous system. After you are born, PAX6 continues to regulate that development. It's in total control of which genes express themselves. Now, while any of these areas would be fascinating to look at, the one which has told us the most The room we are going to spend the most time in is the eye. When it comes to evolution and understanding evolution, the one organ which has given us the most trouble is the eye. It's an incredible piece of work, almost too incredible. It's hard to believe that something so complicated, so specialized, can have evolved, especially when you consider what it can do. It allows you to focus on an object, adjust to changes in light, even light at the quantum level, and it basically works like a camera, projecting light and shadow to the back of the eye, where the photoreceptors collect that information, all the information that's being sent to them, and transmits this back to the brain for processing. Now that's an extremely simplified version, of course, but even simplified is incredible. And it's not just us. All animals have this ability. Well, most animals have this ability. It's just that some appear to be more developed than others.
And you find all over the animal kingdom eyes in various stages of what look like stages of evolution.
That's Professor Richard Dawkins during an interview that he gave about the evolution of the eye. And when you look at the animal kingdom, it's true. There are eyes like ours, eyes that appear to be severely underdeveloped, like those of moles, and others like the squid, which appear to be even better than ours, at least in how they function. Our eyes, during their evolution, developed a blind spot. It's a little backwards in how it evolved. That blind spot is there because our optic nerve passes right through the optic disc, and that's where our photoreceptor cells are located. Squids don't have this problem, and it's odd when you consider the fact that the last common ancestor shared between us and squids scuttled across the ocean floor 500 million years ago. Charles Darwin recognized very early on the problem that his theory had when it came to the development of eyes. He knew nothing about genes, let alone Pax genes. In spite of this, he theorized as to how the eyes might have come about. He thought long and hard about eyes. He allowed us a peek into these thoughts in Chapter 6 of On the Origin of Species.
To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree.
Now, this is the very problem some of us even have today. It does seem to be absurd in the highest degree. Yet, Darwin reasoned
that if numerous gradations from a perfect and complex eye to one very imperfect and simple, each grade being useful to its possessor, can be shown to exist, if further the eye does vary ever so slightly, and the variations be inherited, which is certainly the case, and if any variation or modification in the organ ever be useful to an animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though insuperable by our imagination, can hardly be considered real. How a nerve comes to be sensitive to light hardly concerns us, more than how life itself first originated. But I may remark that several facts make me suspect that any sensitive nerve may be rendered sensitive to light, and likewise to those coarser vibrations of the air which produce sound.
Looking back, reading his thoughts on the subject reveals how truly remarkable he was when it came to understanding the world around him, and how it came to be. The nerve cells he referred to are actually our photoreceptor cells. They're sensitive to light, like our eardrums are sensitive to vibrations in the air. Now, it's not hard to imagine, with a little bit of creativity, how it is that a light-sensitive area could have benefited the very first organism to have developed it. Now, take a group of these organisms, give one this ability, and it will be the one that can sense when a shadow passes overhead. Now, that shadow could be a predator. That same set of sensitive cells would also allow this little organism to move towards the light and out of the darkness. And over time, these cells will become more specialized. And by over time, we're talking millions of years. It's hard to truly conceive of that amount of time when we live only a few decades at best. A few 100 million years can do quite a lot. Every time you look in the mirror, you're looking at the results in more ways than one. Now today, we know a lot more about the development of eyes than Darwin did.
More recent evidence on embryology, actually how embryos develop from genes, suggests that there are very surprising similarities right the way across the animal kingdom. For example, just to take eyes, since we're talking about eyes, there are genes which are recognizably the same gene right the way across the animal kingdom. Recognizably the same genes in that literally the sequence of DNA letters is not identical, but it's sufficiently similar that you can tell that it must come from a shared ancestor, very, very, very ancient shared ancestor. And I think I'm right in saying that all animals have this particular gene, and it goes under different names, but all animals have this particular gene, recognizably the same gene, and it always, when it does anything, it tends to make eyes.
The eyes that it makes may work on different optical principles.
So experimentally, for example, people have taken this gene from a mouse and put it into a developing fruit fly.
The man who led the team which did this was Swiss biologist Walter Gehring. In the 1958 movie The Fly, a scientist testing a teleportation device accidentally combined his DNA with that of a fly. Now, this theme was revisited in 1986 in an even creepier version. In the updated one, which starred Jeff Goldblum, the transformation of man into fly was more gradual. And it's almost as if certain genetic switches had been turned, or which before had been turned off, were suddenly being flipped on, one by one. Now, truth can be stranger than fiction, and while Hollywood's goal had been to terrify us, science has more noble aspirations. It doesn't make them any less strange, however. And it involves flies. Like Darwin, Walter Gehring was amazed by the development of eyes. What gave Professor Gehring an advantage over Darwin was that he had the benefit of Darwin's theories to build upon, as well as decades of scientific study and evidence to work with. And what fascinated Gehring was the proliferation of eyes in the animal kingdom. Here was a planet with millions of species, both past and present, and each one, with some exceptions, evolved eyes. In most cases, 2 eyes. And in the case of insects like flies, they have 2 groups of compound eyes. Compound eyes are groups of small eyes, and each of these little eyes has its own lens. Now, I mentioned earlier that squids have eyes similar to our own. Even clams have eyes. They may not be very complicated eyes when compared to ours, but when you think about it, any configuration of photoreceptor cells that can detect light and affect an organism's actions is complicated in itself. There are so many different types of eyes that one would think that they had to have evolved separately, right? That each one happens to be the lucky result of an evolutionary path that picked up a pair of eyes along the way. It seems to be a necessity that nature is happy to oblige. Gehring wasn't happy with that answer. His research and years of study led him to conclude that eyes hadn't evolved multiple times. They evolved once. They all used the same set of genes that had evolved and then split off into different directions. And at the bottom of it all was one gene, one master gene, the eye switch. Gehring knew that this gene could stop an eye from forming. Shut it off and an eye would never appear. In every animal, it was the same gene. That one gene controlled the entire program, a program which consisted of around 2,000 more genes. Now, this controller is, of course, the PAX6 gene that I've mentioned earlier. Now, Gehring wasn't a mad scientist, nor was he a scientist with a teleportation device to test. But what he did have was the ability to manipulate genes. Gehring wondered what would happen if he were to use the PAX6 gene of a fly and use it elsewhere on the fly's body. Say maybe a wing. So he did. And that wing grew eyes. The compound eyes that it grew even worked. He then did the same thing on a fly's leg. Gehring was able to prove that this master gene, the PAX6, was capable of expressing the genes for eyes anywhere he directed it to. And since he felt that all animals shared the same master gene, what if he were to
take the mouse gene, which is identical in sequence to the human gene, very highly conserved, stick this into flies, and see whether it can induce ectopic eyes, and it does. So flies can understand mice, and of course they make a Drosophila eye because you've only exchanged the main switch. It's like coming into a house. Before you can turn on all of the lamps all over the house, you have to pull the main switch, and the main switch is from the mouse, but the rest of the genes, you need at least 2,000 genes to make an eye, therefore you get a Drosophila eye.
So he did.
This all seems horrible.
Well, not really horrible. It's not like the fly suddenly sprouted a mouse eye. In fact, nothing out of the ordinary happened. The fly formed perfectly normal compound eyes, using the PAX6 gene from a mouse. It's like going to the hardware store and buying a new light switch. It'll work in any home and in any room. It does the exact same thing, no matter where you put it.
And we've also tried the reverse, so we have put the Drosophila gene into frog embryos, and in frog embryos we can induce ectopic eye structures with the Drosophila gene.
The PAX6 is pretty much the same in every animal. What it does is it switches off the animal eye program, which already knows what sort of eye needs to be made. What this showed was that Gehring was right. The eye most likely evolved one time, and he found the master switch to prove it. He could take that switch and put it into a fly, a mouse, or even a frog, and a human, if he so wished to, and it would do its job perfectly well. You wouldn't get a monster like in the fly movies, you would just get eyes. As I mentioned, there are many master switches, other PAX genes. There's the PAX2 gene, which is responsible for kidney development, and the PAX9, which, without it, you wouldn't be able to chew your food. It provides for the development of teeth. Swap these genes around with other animals, and you won't see abominations in nature. What you will see is that things work the way that nature selected for them to work. One time, and from many different forms. Evolution Talk is written and produced by myself, Rick Coast. The music on this episode was composed and performed by Poddington Bear. Support for Evolution Talk comes from you, simply by listening. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now you can always reach me by using the site's contact page or on Twitter, where you can find me at Rick Coast. And most of all, thank you for listening. And until next time, please take care of yourself.
I saw that funny-looking fly again.
You saw the fly? Where?
It's in a web. Spider's going to get it. By the bench, in the garden.
You're sure?
Oh, yes. You're a good friend, Swallow.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.
Be afraid. Be very afraid.